It was the sort of English summer afternoon that could almost make one forget the Second World War had ever happened. The garden at Ferndale House, tucked neatly at the edge of the village of Lydney Cross, bloomed with reckless cheer. The roses bowed gently in the breeze as though aware they were being admired, and the air was filled with the faint scent of lavender and lemon biscuits. Mrs. Eleanor Brathwaite, the widowed lady of the house, stood beside the tea-table with the gracious composure of someone who considered herself essential to village continuity. She wore a pale lilac dress, pearls that caught the light, and an expression suggesting mild condescension toward both the weather and the guests. The annual garden fete, though technically in aid of the church roof, was more a performance of village unity than religious fundraising. Miss Jane Marple sat slightly apart from the others, her delicate hands folded in her lap, her blue eyes flicking, unnoticed, from person to person. She wore a dove grey shawl over her shoulders, though the day was warm. She appeared quite content, sipping weak tea and listening politely to Miss Temple's long-winded tale about her cousin's cat and its infatuation with buttered scones. But Jane Marple was not a woman who let her eyes wander idly. Her mind was, as ever, taking stock. "Isn't it a lovely turnout?" murmured the vicar's wife, Mrs. Partridge, sidling beside her. "Though I dare say Mrs. Temple's meringues might cause more scandal than salvation." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "One must take one's sins in small doses, I always say." Her gaze lingered on the tall French windows of the drawing-room behind the garden table. The heavy brocade curtains had been drawn back in a rather peculiar way, half-tied with a green ribbon on one side, fully released on the other, as though someone had been interrupted midway through the task. She noticed it, then filed it away. At that very moment, a young woman came hurrying down the garden path, her face pale and her footsteps far too brisk for polite company. It was Evelyn Grove, the housemaid, 21, shy, and never quite at ease during these grand events. Her fingers twisted in her apron as she whispered something to Mrs. Brathwaite, whose face blanched to a chalky white before recovering into a fragile mask of poise. "I'm dreadfully sorry," Mrs. Brathwaite announced after a short silence. "There's been a most unfortunate incident. If you would all please return to your homes, I shall make inquiries with the authorities." Murmurs of confusion rippled through the gathering. Colonel Foster, retired and rosily sunburnt, looked ready to launch into a speech. Mrs. Penelope Cartwright clutched her pearls in anticipation. But Miss Marple had already risen, setting her teacup gently on the silver tray and moving with quiet purpose through the open French doors into the house. Inside the drawing-room, everything smelled faintly of dust and faded glory. Evelyn stood, rigid by the hearth, her eyes full of fear. There on the Aubusson rug, face turned toward the unlit fireplace, lay the body of a man. Miss Marple paused only briefly before kneeling, not too close, just enough to observe without disturbing. She took in the man's features. Late 50s, balding slightly, a distinguished silver moustache. His eyes stared vacantly, and a narrow crimson line trickled from the base of his skull. "I believe," said Miss Marple quietly, "that is Major Alan Segrave. I last saw him near the rose arbour just before tea, quite alive at the time." There was a stunned silence. Mrs. Brathwaite now looked as though she might faint. I had no idea he'd returned to Lydney Cross. He wasn't, even on the guest list." "No," said Miss Marple, her voice calm. "But then neither are murderers." And just behind her, the thick brocade curtain stirred slightly, as if exhaling a secret of its own. The silence that followed Miss Marple's quiet pronouncement was taut with unease. The genteel civility of the afternoon had evaporated, replaced by something colder, more brittle. Evelyn Grove stood frozen, her hands still gripping the edge of her apron as if afraid to let go. Her wide, frightened eyes stared at the body of Major Seagrave, and in the quiet that hung like fog in the drawing-room, her shallow breaths were audible. Mrs. Brathwaite, pale but composed, cleared her throat delicately and turned to Miss Marple. "I think perhaps we should call Inspector Cray. This is quite beyond us." "Of course," said Miss Marple, "though I would advise ensuring that no one leaves the premises until the police arrive. It's so easy for details to become muddled once people begin talking." Mrs. Brathwaite hesitated, likely calculating the optics of detaining one's garden party guests, but nodded. Yes, quite right. Evelyn, please ask Mr. Dobson to see that the guests are ushered into the conservatory, calmly if you can." Evelyn bobbed a shaky curtsy and disappeared with haste, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Miss Marple approached the window again, where the curtain hung awkwardly. She reached out, fingers brushing the fabric lightly. It was thick, velvet, dark blue with a floral fringe, the kind that held scent and memory. Her fingers traced the tie-back, green grosgrain ribbon, frayed at the edge, and she tugged it slightly. The curtain unfurled, releasing a faint rustle. Behind it, the second body was not immediately visible, at least not to someone expecting a full form sprawled dramatically on the floor. But Miss Marple noticed the corner of a shoe first. Then, the telltale edge of a jacket sleeve, barely visible beneath the window seat. She stepped back and turned toward Mrs. Brathwaite. "I'm afraid there's more. Would you be so kind as to look here?" Mrs. Brathwaite's gasp was sharp. She moved forward, one hand fluttering near her collarbone. When her eyes followed Miss Marple's pointed glance, her breath caught again, so loudly that it seemed to pull the air from the room. There, half concealed behind the curtain and beneath the window seat, lay another man, this one much younger, in his early 30s perhaps, with a mop of brown hair and a clean-shaven, boyish face. He lay curled on his side, eyes closed, blood pooled darkly beneath his temple. It was clear, without needing to touch him, that he too was dead. "I believe," said Miss Marple gently, "that's Christopher Enderby. Was he not your nephew?" Mrs. Brathwaite could only nod, her eyes wide, her face drained of colour. It was at that precise moment that the drawing-room doors opened and Colonel Foster stepped in with a puff of indignant breath. "Now see here, if there's some sort of accident or— Oh, good Lord!" He froze. His gaze fell first on Major Seagrave's body, then, as Miss Marple drew aside the curtain fully, to the hidden corpse of young Christopher Enderby. The Colonel's ruddy face turned a shade paler. "By Jove," he murmured. "Two of them. Well, this isn't some countryside stumble after all, is it?" Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "It does rather complicate matters, doesn't it?" Within half an hour, Inspector Cray had arrived, bringing with him the sort of stern, bristled efficiency the village rarely saw outside of harvest disputes and the occasional broken shop window. He was a tall man with iron-grey hair and a habit of speaking as if every word were part of a firm instruction. "Mrs. Brathwaite," he said, after greeting the household, "I'll need the names of every guest at the garden party, and I'd ask that no one leaves Lydney Cross for the time being. This is clearly a double homicide." Miss Marple remained quietly in the corner, observing as the inspector inspected the room, asked the expected questions, and examined the two bodies without disturbing them. She did not interrupt, not yet. "Major Seagrave," Inspector Cray muttered, eyeing the elder man's body. "Last seen in the area over 2 years ago, if I recall. Rumours of gambling debts and a rather hasty departure abroad." Mrs. Brathwaite cleared her throat faintly. "I hadn't seen him since before the war. He and my late husband were acquainted long ago." "And the other?" Cray asked. "My nephew, Christopher. He came down from London only last week to stay. He'd taken up some position with an advertising firm. He was always cheerful." Miss Marple, her knitting now resting loosely in her lap, though untouched, ventured in a tone of mild curiosity. Cheerful, yes, but I couldn't help noticing he seemed rather on edge this past Tuesday. He dropped his tea twice when Mrs. Denton asked after his time in Spain. Said something about not remembering much from the trip. Inspector Cray turned to her, polite but firm. "Miss Marple, you were present at the fete?" "Oh, yes. Since just after 3:30. I sat near the trellis with the climbing clematis. It gives a good view of the garden, though not, I fear, into this room. Did you see either of the victims earlier? Major Seagrave, briefly. Near the rose. Aber, he was alone, seemed to be reading something, a letter, I think, and Christopher passed me shortly before tea. He was looking for Evelyn Grove. I remember because he asked me whether I'd seen her." Cray frowned. "The housemaid?" "Yes. She looked quite unsettled this afternoon, wouldn't you agree?" Cray jotted a note, then turned to Mrs. Brathwaite. "Would you mind terribly if I spoke to your staff? I'd like to speak with Evelyn first." "Of course," she replied, voice low. "She should be in the kitchen." As the inspector left, Miss Marple remained behind with Mrs. Brathwaite, who sank slowly onto a settee. "2 deaths, she said faintly, "and both in my home." "I expect that's precisely why," said Miss Marple, her voice light, almost wistful. "Crimes tend to happen where people feel protected or hidden." Mrs. Brathwaite looked up sharply. Do you think they knew each other? Seagrave and Christopher?" Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the curtain again. "I imagine so. In fact, I suspect Christopher knew a great deal more than he ever let on. The way he acted this past week, fidgety, restless. I once saw a young man behave the same way years ago in St. Mary Mead, just before he confessed to forging railway bonds. It's the guilt that gives them away, not the crime." A soft knock interrupted the moment, and Cray returned, followed closely by Evelyn, who looked even paler than before. "I've just spoken to her," Cray said quietly. "She says she found the body when coming to collect a teacup tray. I didn't know there was a second," Evelyn stammered, her voice barely audible. "Not until Miss Marple showed us." Cray nodded, expression unreadable. "She also says Christopher Enderby was in the drawing room shortly after the party began. Alone." Miss Marple tapped her chin thoughtfully. "I wonder, Evelyn, when you came in to fetch the tray, did you see anything unusual?" The girl blinked. "Only the curtain. It was funny, as if someone had hidden behind it." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Yes, quite so." Evelyn's voice wavered. "Do you think Christopher was hiding?" "Oh no, my dear," Miss Marple said softly. "I think he was already dead. It's the person who placed him behind the curtain we must concern ourselves with. And I rather think they were watching us all along." Inspector Cray turned sharply toward Miss Marple. "Watching us? Do you mean someone remained in this room hidden behind that curtain even as the party carried on?" Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No, Inspector, not quite. I mean, someone took great care to place Christopher's body there deliberately, intending it not to be found immediately. There's a certain stagecraft to it. You see, most people, upon discovering a body, would have no reason to look behind a curtain again, especially not with Major Seagrave lying in full view." Cray frowned, considering her words. "So you believe Christopher was killed first, and Seagrave afterward?" "It would seem so, wouldn't it? The placement of the bodies implies a sequence, one visible, one concealed. That usually speaks to intent, to narrative, if you will." Evelyn, still standing uncertainly by the door, gave a little shudder. "Then who would want Mr. Enderby dead? He hadn't even been in the village long enough to make enemies." Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "People don't need long, Evelyn. Sometimes a few hours is more than enough, if something is discovered, or if a danger is perceived." Cray gave Evelyn a nod of dismissal, and the girl fled gratefully. The inspector sighed. We'll need a post-mortem to confirm the order of deaths. But assuming you're right, Miss Marple, what motive could there be? Christopher was a young man. Quiet, pleasant, Seagrave. Well, he was known for less pleasant things, but why would the killer deal with both? Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She returned to her knitting, as if the gentle clack of needles helped her think more clearly. After a moment she said, I wonder if perhaps the second murder wasn't about eliminating a rival, but about silencing a witness. Cray narrowed his eyes. You think Christopher saw something? Knew something? I believe he did. And whatever it was, it must have frightened him enough to make him seek someone out. Perhaps someone he thought could help. Mrs. Brathwaite, who had been silently sitting on the edge of the settee, now spoke. You don't mean me? Possibly, Miss Marple said gently. Or Evelyn. Or even one of the other guests. Someone he trusted, or thought he did. Cray cleared his throat. I want to speak to the other guests, of course. But first I'll need to verify the comings and goings. Mrs. Brathwaite, did anyone arrive late to the party? Mrs. Brathwaite thought. Yes. Lady Denholm arrived a quarter hour after the tea was poured. She made a fuss about the biscuits, I recall, and Mr. Cartwright, George Cartwright, he came just before the speeches, claimed his bicycle chain had snapped, though I dare say he was simply avoiding polite company. Cray made a note. Anyone leave early? I believe the vicar's wife excused herself around 5, Mrs. Brathwaite said slowly. Something about needing to prepare for evensong. But she wouldn't. She trailed off, unwilling to finish the thought. Miss Marple glanced toward the window, the late afternoon light stretching long across the parquet. Time will tell. I believe, if I may say so, that you will find your answers in something much less dramatic than confessions or alibis. Cray raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? People, said Miss Marple, tend to do what they've always done, even when they murder. Especially when they murder. Habits don't vanish, only intentions change. Before Cray could respond, a constable entered, holding a small folded paper. Inspector, we found this in Major Seagrave's jacket. Looks like a letter, might be important. Cray took the paper and unfolded it. His brows knit as he read aloud. You said you'd tell me the truth this time. I'll be there. But if I find you've lied again, you'll regret it. This is your final chance. He looked up. Unsigned. No date. But the paper's crisp, clearly recent. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. A final chance indeed. That doesn't sound like a conversation between strangers, does it? I wonder who wrote it. Cray folded the note carefully. I'll have it examined, though I expect no fingerprints. These sorts are always careful, Miss Marple smiled faintly. Careful perhaps, but rarely thoughtful in the truest sense. Rage, Inspector, is a poor companion to planning. Cray nodded. Very well. Let's begin with the guests. If you'll excuse me, Mrs. Brathwaite, I'll use the study. She gave a nod, and Cray departed with quiet authority. Miss Marple remained seated for a while, her knitting resting once more in her lap, though the needles had stilled. Mrs. Brathwaite watched her with wary curiosity. You don't think this has anything to do with the past, do you? Miss Marple glanced up. The past has a peculiar way of surfacing, my dear, like a bit of lace that refuses to stay tucked beneath a bodice. I'd say both these men, Christopher and the Major, were tied to something that began some years ago, something unfinished. Mrs. Brathwaite paled slightly, but said nothing. The following hour passed with quiet footfall and low murmurs, as Inspector Cray took statements one by one. Miss Marple wandered into the conservatory where the remaining guests had been gently corralled with tea and reassurances. They sat in little huddled knots, some speaking in hushed voices, others staring off, as if waiting for reality to resume. She spotted Lady Denholm almost immediately, resplendent in lilac silk, Her lips pursed in habitual disdain. She sipped her tea with exaggerated delicacy. "Quite the day, isn't it?" Miss Marple said as she approached. Lady Denholm sniffed. "I dare say it was bound to happen. What with all these outsiders invited to what should have been a private affair. I told Alice as much last week." Miss Marple nodded. "I quite agree. And yet I couldn't help but notice you arrived late." Lady blinked, then sniffed again. "I was detained by the gardener. One of the rhododendrons has developed scale. Quite the disaster, I assure you." "Yes, I'm sure," Miss Marple said, watching her. "It must be difficult managing the estate with such limited staff these days." Lady Denholm's gaze sharpened. "You're fishing, Miss Marple. I don't care for it." Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "I know, Lady Denholm. No one ever does, until the hook catches something." She moved on past the clergyman's wife, who sat trembling slightly, hands folded in prayer. The guests were shadows of themselves now, flattened, muted by the presence of death. Near the far corner of the room, George Cartwright stood by the window, staring out into the garden. Miss Marple watched him quietly before approaching. "Mr. Cartwright," she said gently, "you arrived late today?" He turned, his boyish face lined with unease. "Yes." "My bicycle." "Yes, you said." Miss Marple interrupted gently. "Odd, though, how it happened the moment you were meant to recite that poem. You know, I heard you perform once in Bath. You were terribly good." He gave a wry smile. "I'm not so fond of public readings these days." "No," Miss Marple said, eyes sharp. "And yet you returned to Lydney Cross just last month, after being away nearly 4 years, right around the time Christopher Enderby did." Cartwright tensed. "Coincidence? I doubt it." He said nothing. Miss Marple tilted her head. "What did Christopher know, Mr. Cartwright? What did he threaten to reveal?" His voice dropped. "He said he'd found something. An old letter, something Seagrave wrote. He didn't tell me what was in it, just said it would ruin the Major. Said he was going to use it to make things right." "Did he show it to you?" Cartwright hesitated. "No," Miss Marple's eyes didn't waver. "But you believed him. Enough to follow him here." He swallowed hard. "I wanted to stop him. I didn't want anyone hurt. And yet," she said softly, "now 2 people are dead." He looked down. Miss Marple placed a hand lightly on his sleeve. "Tell Inspector Cray what you know. All of it. Secrets fester, Mr. Cartwright, and they never stay buried." As she walked away, the light had shifted. Evening shadows began to stretch along the walls. Somewhere outside, a clock chimed 6, and Miss Marple knew. The past had risen, and someone in Lydney Cross had gambled that 2 deaths might keep it silent. They had been wrong. The evening deepened into a close-knit hush that wrapped the village like a soft shawl. Through the tall windows of the drawing-room, the garden lay cloaked in the gentle silver of the rising moon, the scent of jasmine faint but persistent on the air. Inside, the atmosphere was taut with unspoken questions and guarded glances. "Inspector." Cray had just finished his round of interviews and was now poring over his notes at the great oak desk, while Miss Marple sat quietly nearby, her fingers folding and unfolding a piece of paper as if the motion helped her thoughts align. A gentle rap at the door interrupted the stillness, and the constable entered, carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. "Inspector, this was found in the library fireplace. It appears to have been thrown in recently, but was retrieved before it could be completely burned." Cray took the parcel with a furrowed brow and carefully untied it. Inside there was a bundle of letters, some brittle with age and others more recent, their ink faded but legible. He glanced toward Miss Marple. "Curious, isn't it? This must be the cache of documents Christopher was so interested in." Miss Marple nodded. "It's often the quietest things, Inspector, that carry the loudest truths." She reached forward and unfolded one of the newer letters, scanning it quickly. Here, this one appears to be from the Major himself, dated nearly 20 years ago. It speaks of an arrangement, a secret kept between two parties, one that was to remain buried for the good of all involved. She looked up, eyes bright with quiet intensity. That secret, it seems, was never meant to see the light of day again. Cray leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. Do you suppose Christopher stumbled on this, and that's why he was silenced? Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. That is a reasonable supposition, but remember, this secret implicates more than just Major Seagrave. There are names here, names of several villagers, some of whom are still present tonight. The inspector's gaze swept the room slowly, taking in the faces etched with fatigue and anxiety. We'll need to secure these letters, and I'll have them examined for anything that might help. Outside, a faint rustling sound caught Miss Marple's attention. She rose and moved toward the window, pulling aside the curtain just as the moonlight caught a figure slipping through the garden's shadowy paths. The silhouette paused briefly, as if watching the house, then moved on. "Inspector?" she said softly. "It seems someone is not quite ready to let this mystery rest. The game is far from over." Cray joined her at the window, his expression darkening. "I'll have the grounds searched immediately. No one in or out without my knowledge." Miss Marple turned back into the room, noting how even the most composed among them now wore the marks of unease. The village of Lydney Cross, so serene in appearance, was a nest of old secrets and fragile alliances. The sound of footsteps drew their attention to the door, where Evelyn stood hesitantly, clutching her shawl around her shoulders. "Miss Marple, Inspector. May I speak with you? It's about Christopher." The two exchanged a glance before Cray nodded. "Of course. Come in, Evelyn." She stepped inside, her eyes wide and trembling. "Christopher, he wasn't the man you think. He was frightened, yes, but it wasn't just about the letters. There was something else." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "Please, tell us everything you know." Evelyn took a shaky breath. The day before the party, Christopher found a box in the attic of his cottage. It belonged to his late father, Mr. Enderby Sr., and inside were photographs and documents, things that should have been forgotten. Among them was a picture of Major Seagrave and a woman who looked very familiar. "Familiar?" Cray prompted. Evelyn nodded. "Yes, it was my mother." The room fell silent. "Your mother?" Miss Marple repeated softly. "That changes matters considerably." Evelyn swallowed, her voice dropping almost to a whisper. "I didn't know until then that my mother had any connection to the Major. She never spoke of it. But Christopher believed this linked to why he was warned, why he was being watched. He thought someone wanted to keep the truth about their families hidden." Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. "Family secrets have a way of intertwining with community stories, Evelyn, often more tightly than one might wish." Cray's gaze fixed sharply on Evelyn. "And did Christopher tell you who else might have known of this?" "Only George Cartwright," she said quickly. Christopher had trusted him since they were boys. But even George was in the dark about some details. Christopher planned to confront Major Seagrave at the party to demand answers. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly as she resumed her seat. Confrontations often reveal more than intended, and sometimes provoke desperate acts. Cray rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "We need to find out exactly what was said during that confrontation." Before anyone could reply, the door opened again and George Cartwright entered. His face was pale, and his hands trembled as he held a folded piece of paper. I found this in Christopher's room," he said, voice barely steady. "He wrote it just before the party. It's a note to someone, maybe a confession or a warning." Miss Marple took the paper delicately, and read aloud. "If anything happens to me, look behind the curtain. The truth is not where it seems. Trust no one but those who know the past." She looked up sharply. Behind the curtain? The same curtain where Christopher's body was concealed. Cray's eyes narrowed. "It's a clue, a deliberate one." "But to whom was this note addressed?" Evelyn asked. Cartwright shook his head. "I don't know. Christopher was secretive. He wanted to protect Evelyn, and perhaps others." Miss Marple's gaze settled on Cartwright. "You've kept your secrets well, George. But sometimes, in protecting others, one protects the guilty." Cartwright swallowed hard but said nothing. Cray turned to the group. "We have to consider the possibility that the murderer is among us. Someone who knew Christopher's intentions and feared exposure." The tension thickened, a quiet storm waiting to break. Miss Marple's eyes swept the faces before her. "And now, the game begins in earnest. Everyone has a role, whether they like it or not. It is time to watch closely, to listen carefully, and to follow the thread wherever it leads." As the clock chimed 7, the village of Lydney Cross settled deeper into its shadows. Outside, unseen eyes lingered in the darkness, while inside, the fragile dance of trust and suspicion continued. The curtain that hid the second body had not only concealed a crime but also the key to unraveling the tangled web of secrets binding this quiet village, and Miss Marple was ready to uncover every stitch. The morning dawned grey and heavy with mist, a shroud that seemed fitting for the unsettled mood lingering over Lydney Cross. Miss Marple, dressed in her usual modest attire, rose early and took her customary walk through the village lanes before the bustle of the day began. The dew clung to the hedgerows, and the faint aroma of damp earth mingled with the distant scent of wood smoke. It was in these quiet moments that she found clarity. The village, much like its people, revealed its true colours not in grand gestures, but in the small, often overlooked details. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Inspector Cray approaching, his expression more solemn than usual. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he greeted. "I've just returned from the cottage at the edge of the village, the one Christopher called home." Miss Marple nodded, folding her hands. "And what have you discovered, Inspector?" "There's been a careful search of the attic and the rooms," Cray replied. "We found a few more documents hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Journals, belonging to Christopher's father. It seems the family has been guarding more than just photographs, secrets wrapped in ink and paper." "Secrets are the currency of a village," Miss Marple mused. "The past never truly dies." Cray glanced sideways. "There's something else. The housekeeper mentioned that on the night of the party, Christopher received an unexpected visitor, a man she did not recognize. The visitor left hastily, but not before Christopher seemed visibly disturbed." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Do we know who this visitor was?" "Not yet. But the housekeeper recalled the man had a distinct accent, something foreign, perhaps from London or further afield. That's an interesting lead. Outsiders often unsettle the delicate balance of village life." They walked slowly back toward the village centre, the conversation flowing with the ease of old acquaintances accustomed to one another's rhythms. Meanwhile, back at the village hall, Evelyn and George Cartwright were seated in quiet conversation, their faces shadowed by the weight of recent revelations. Evelyn had barely slept, her thoughts restless and tangled. George, ever more composed, was trying to steady her nerves. "Evelyn," he said gently, "there is more to all this than we understand. Christopher's death is only the surface." She looked up, her eyes searching his. "Do you think someone else is in danger?" George hesitated. "I don't know. But I do know Christopher believed the past would catch up with us all, and it seems it has." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Simmons, the village physician, who had been quietly observing the proceedings from the sidelines. He approached the pair with a grave expression. "I've been reviewing the autopsy report," he began. "There's something odd about the timing of Christopher's death." Evelyn frowned. "Odd? I thought it was clear. It was during the party, when everyone was present." Dr. Simmons shook his head. "The injuries indicate he may have been alive for several hours after the supposed time of death. The implication is that he might have been moved, hidden, before being discovered." George's eyes widened. "Moved? But why?" "That's the question," Miss Marple interjected quietly as she joined them. "And it fits with the note Christopher left about the curtain." Evelyn's voice trembled. "You mean someone deliberately concealed his body?" Miss Marple nodded. "And perhaps more than that, wished to buy time, to create confusion." Inspector Cray rejoined the group, having overheard the latter part of their conversation. "I've been thinking about that visitor," he said. "If Christopher was disturbed, someone may have confronted him, perhaps even threatened him." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to Evelyn. "Did Christopher ever confide in you about fears or enemies?" Evelyn bit her lip, hesitant. "Only that he felt watched, and that his father's past was darker than anyone believed." "Dark indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "The journals hint at financial disputes, old grievances, even a scandal involving the Major, a scandal some would kill to keep hidden." The conversation was abruptly broken by the arrival of Mr. Giles Hawthorne, the local postmaster. His usually genial face was pale and drawn. "There's been another discovery," he announced breathlessly. "Near the edge of the woods, not far from Christopher's cottage, something buried beneath the roots of an old oak." Inspector Cray's interest was immediately piqued. "A second body?" he asked. "Yes," Hawthorne confirmed. "It appears to be human remains, but we won't know for certain until the experts examine it." Miss Marple's heart quickened. A second victim meant the stakes were higher than ever, and the village's veneer of tranquility was cracking wide open. "Who could it be?" Evelyn whispered, dread creeping into her voice. "No one knows yet," Cray replied grimly. "But this changes everything. We may be dealing with a long-hidden crime finally coming to light." Miss Marple stared into the distance, her mind piecing together fragments of conversation, motives, and behaviors. The curtain had concealed not just one secret, but perhaps a multitude of sins, layered beneath years of silence. As the day wore on, villagers gathered once more, their whispers now tinged with fear and suspicion. Faces once familiar took on sharper edges and smiles became rarer. Miss Marple moved quietly among them, noting the subtle changes in posture, the fleeting glances exchanged like secret messages, and the undercurrent of tension pulsing just beneath polite conversation. She found herself drawn again to George Cartwright, whose calm exterior masked a storm of emotions. "George," she said softly, "you hold a key to this mystery, though perhaps unknowingly. Trust your instincts, but remember, the truth often lies where the light does not reach." George nodded slowly, his expression somber. "I fear the darkness is deeper than any of us imagined." In the quiet of the drawing room later that evening, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her hands resting on her lap as she contemplated the tangled web before her. The letters, the second body, the mysterious visitor, all threads in a complex tapestry woven from fear, betrayal, and desperation. The village of Lydney Cross was no longer a place of simple secrets. It was a stage for shadows, and the curtain was about to be drawn back. And Miss Marple, with her keen eye and gentle wisdom, was ready to watch closely as the final act unfolded. The discovery of the second body near the ancient oak cast a long shadow over Lydney Cross, turning whispered rumours into urgent questions and casual observations into pointed suspicions. The village, once so accustomed to its measured pace and familiar routines, now seemed to pulse with an anxious energy, as if the ground beneath their feet trembled with the weight of buried secrets. Miss Marple, undeterred by the growing tension, set about her quiet investigation with renewed focus. She had long known that the heart of a mystery lay not in the overt facts, but in the silences and subtle gestures of those involved. Each glance avoided, each word carefully chosen, and every hesitation was a clue as telling as any found beneath the soil. Inspector Cray was busier than ever, coordinating with forensic experts who meticulously catalogued the remains and examined the scene under the sprawling oak. Initial reports suggested the body had been there for some years, long before Christopher's recent troubles, but its presence nonetheless held significance. The link between the two deaths was yet unclear, but it was impossible to dismiss the coincidence. At the village inn, where locals gathered for their evening drinks, the atmosphere was thick with speculation. Conversations sprang up in hushed tones, each theory more elaborate than the last. Mrs. Pettigrew, the innkeeper, was overheard confiding to a cluster of villagers that the second body might belong to a man who vanished from the village decades ago, a man whose disappearance had been quietly hushed up. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in a corner with her knitting, observed the gathering with a practiced eye. She noticed that not all present shared the same sense of fear. Some seemed more wary, their eyes flickering with something closer to guilt or relief. One such figure was Harold Finch, a local antiques dealer known for his nervous demeanour and quick temper. Miss Marple recalled how Harold had avoided her gaze earlier when she casually mentioned the second body. The following morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to the cottage where Christopher had lived. It was a modest dwelling on the edge of the woods, now cordoned off by the police. She lingered near the garden gate, examining the earth beneath the large curtain Christopher had referenced in his note. The fabric, still hanging though weathered by time, seemed almost like a barrier between the past and present, a veil hiding truths just out of reach. Nearby, the village children played, their laughter incongruous with the solemnity of the investigation. Yet even in their innocent chatter, Miss Marple caught snippets that gave her pause. One small voice spoke of seeing a strange man lurking near the cottage late at night, a figure none of the adults had mentioned. The description was vague but consistent with the mysterious visitor Inspector Cray had noted. Inside the cottage, Miss Marple carefully examined the journals and letters Christopher's father had left behind. The pages were filled with references to old disputes, land deals, and an estranged brother whose name had been conspicuously absent from family conversations. There was mention of a final reckoning and warnings to protect what was rightfully theirs. As she turned each page, a pattern emerged, one of bitterness and betrayal, entwined with greed and desperation. The family feud, buried beneath polite smiles and social gatherings, was a festering wound. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to George Cartwright, whose calmness seemed at odds with the storm beneath the surface. Was he merely a bystander, or something more? Later that day, the inspector summoned Miss Marple for a discreet conversation. They met in the quiet of the village library, away from prying eyes and eager ears. Miss Marple, Cray began, "We've identified the second body. It's Thomas Granger, the missing man Mrs. Pettigrew mentioned. He disappeared nearly 20 years ago under suspicious circumstances." Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And the family? Any connection to Christopher?" "None. Directly," Cray replied. "But the records show that Thomas and Christopher's father were bitter rivals, especially over the estate and land rights." "That fits the narrative," Miss Marple said softly. "Old grudges have long shadows. But what puzzles me is why Christopher would be so deeply troubled now. Perhaps he uncovered something that linked these past events to the present." Cray tapped his fingers on the table. "We're also questioning Harold Finch. Several villagers reported seeing him near the woods on the night Christopher disappeared. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. Ah, Harold, nervous and secretive. Did he have any reason to be there? That's what we need to find out. As the evening settled, Miss Marple found herself wandering toward the village churchyard, where Thomas Granger's newly identified grave lay under fresh earth. She traced her fingers lightly over the headstone, feeling the weight of decades of silence. It struck her how much the village's history was intertwined with pain and hidden sins, all carefully buried beneath polite conversation and unremarkable lives. Returning home, she was greeted by a letter slipped under her door. It was anonymous. Written in a hurried scrawl, "Stop digging where you do not belong. The past should remain where it is, or more blood will be spilled." The note was a chilling reminder that some truths were fiercely guarded and that danger lurked not just in shadows but in plain sight. That night, as the village slept uneasily, Miss Marple sat by the window, gazing at the moonlit street. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but the picture remained incomplete. She understood that to solve the mystery, she would have to unravel the complex relationships binding the villagers, the rivalries, the fears, and the buried betrayals. Above all, she knew that the curtain that hid the second body was not merely a piece of fabric, but a metaphor for the deeper secrets the village sought to keep hidden, and she was determined to pull it back, gently but firmly, until every hidden truth was revealed. The following morning, a chill hung in the air, and the village of Lydney Cross felt smaller somehow, as if the weight of unspoken fears pressed the rooftops closer together. Miss Marple, wrapped in her usual shawl, set off on a stroll through the village, her mind turning over the threads of the case. The anonymous letter lingered at the back of her thoughts, a veiled warning, intended to intimidate or perhaps deter. But Miss Marple, seasoned by years of peeling back human pretenses, took it as confirmation that she was indeed close to uncovering something the villagers wanted to keep hidden. She decided to visit Harold Finch once again. The antiques dealer's twitchy disposition and the way he'd avoided eye contact at the inn had made him stand out to her. She found him in his cramped shop near the village green, a cluttered place filled with dusty heirlooms and curiosities from bygone eras. Harold looked startled when she entered, clearly not expecting a social call. "Good morning, Harold," she said gently, choosing her tone to put him at ease. "I was wondering if you might help me with something. You see, Christopher's disappearance has left many of us puzzled, and I hoped you might share what you know." Harold cleared his throat, adjusting his spectacles nervously. I don't know much, Miss Marple. Just that Christopher had enemies like everyone else, I suppose." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her eyes kind but penetrating. "But enemies who might wish him harm, perhaps connected to the land disputes you once mentioned." Harold shifted uncomfortably. "There was talk, yes. Old rivalries with the Cartwright family and some whispered debts. Nothing concrete, though. I heard Christopher was looking into some old papers. Something about the estate's boundaries." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Did you ever see Christopher after dark, near the woods or his cottage?" Harold hesitated, then confessed, "I did see him one evening, a week before he vanished. He was meeting someone by the old curtain. In the garden, I didn't recognize the visitor, only that Christopher looked troubled." "Did you hear what they said?" "Only bits," Harold admitted. "Something about settling accounts and old debts. It didn't sound friendly." Miss Marple thanked him and left, her mind already turning over the possibilities. A clandestine meeting, secret debts, a visitor under the cover of night, all pieces of a puzzle growing more complex. She next called on George Cartwright, the seemingly unruffled family patriarch. George welcomed her with his usual polite reserve, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "I hear you've been asking questions about my late brother's affairs," George said carefully. "Yes, I'm hoping you might clarify some things for me," Miss Marple said smoothly, "especially regarding any disputes over the estate." George sighed, folding his hands. There was tension, I admit. Thomas Granger's disappearance years ago strained the family. Rumours, accusations, none proven. But Christopher, my nephew, he was always curious, digging where he perhaps shouldn't have. Did he confide in you about his findings? George's gaze hardened slightly. No, but I feared his investigations might stir up old ghosts. Some things are better left buried. Miss Marple pressed gently. Were there others who might have wished to silence Christopher's inquiries? George's composure faltered just for a moment. You would do well to speak with Margaret, my sister-in-law. She has insight, I believe. Thanking him, Miss Marple decided to seek out Margaret Cartwright, a woman whose grief over Christopher's death seemed genuine, but shadowed by restraint. Margaret's small cottage on the village's outskirts was surrounded by wild roses, their blooms already fading with the season. Margaret welcomed Miss Marple with a weary smile, inviting her inside for tea. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured the steaming liquid. I fear this village has become too dangerous, Margaret confessed softly. Christopher was trying to protect the family's legacy, but he found something, or someone, he shouldn't have. Do you know who or what that might be? Miss Marple asked. Margaret hesitated, then said, There was talk of a hidden ledger, detailing transactions that could ruin reputations. Christopher believed it was hidden behind the curtain in his garden, but he never found it. The curtain? Miss Marple mused. A symbolic barrier, perhaps, or a literal hiding place. Yes, Margaret nodded. And then there's the matter of Thomas Granger. Some say he wasn't as innocent as we thought. There were rumours he dealt in underhanded business, things that could implicate several villagers. Interesting, Miss Marple said quietly. The past reaching into the present. Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. I worry someone will try to keep those secrets from coming to light at any cost. The conversation left Miss Marple with much to consider. The ledger, the hidden truths, the tangled web of family and village connections. It was all converging toward a climax. That afternoon, as shadows lengthened, a sudden commotion arose at the village square. News spread quickly. The village solicitor's office had been broken into. Papers were scattered, drawers ransacked. Among the missing was the Cartwright estate's legal file, the very documents Christopher had been seeking. Inspector Cray was swift to arrive. He enlisted Miss Marple's counsel once more, valuing her uncanny perception. Together, they inspected the scene. There's no sign of forced entry, Cray observed. The thief knew exactly what to look for. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room, noting a small smudge on the solicitor's desk and a faint scent of tobacco in the air. The culprit is familiar with this place, and with the contents of these files. Someone desperate, Cray muttered. Someone who wants to bury the truth. Miss Marple's thoughts circled back to the villagers she had spoken with. The nervous Harold, the guarded George, the grieving Margaret. And yet, there was one figure she hadn't fully examined. The village doctor, Dr. Samuel Willis, a man whose calm demeanour masked an iron will. She recalled seeing him near the estate the night of Christopher's disappearance, a detail previously overlooked. Miss Marple resolved to pay him a visit, sensing that the doctor's knowledge and possible complicity could be the key to unlocking the tangled mystery. As dusk fell, Miss Marple made her way to the doctor's residence, a neat house with a well-kept garden. Dr. Willis answered the door with a polite but wary expression. Miss Marple, he said, inclining his head. To what do I owe the pleasure? Merely a neighbourly call, she replied smoothly. I hear you were out. Late recently, visiting the Cartwright estate, perhaps? The doctor's eyes narrowed just slightly. Professional duties, nothing more. Miss Marple's gaze held his. Tell me, Doctor, what do you make of the second body found under the oak? Thomas Granger, long missing and now returned from the past. Old wounds never heal easily, Willis said, his voice low. Some truths are better left undisturbed. And yet, Miss Marple pressed, Christopher sought those truths, and now he too is gone. The doctor's face twitched, the faintest flicker of unease betraying his calm exterior. Miss Marple knew then that the doctor's reticence was not mere propriety. There were secrets in Lydney Cross deeper than anyone dared admit, and in the doctor's hands perhaps lay a part of the village's darkest tale. As she departed, the night enveloping her like a cloak, Miss Marple felt the puzzle edging ever closer to completion. The second body, the broken trust, the stolen files, all were threads woven tightly into a fabric of deception. And soon, very soon, the final pattern would be revealed. That evening, as the village settled beneath a star-studded sky, Miss Marple found herself back in the drawing room of her cottage, quietly reflecting on the conversations and discoveries of the day. The threads of suspicion were weaving tighter, yet a certain pattern eluded her still. The stolen legal file, the second body, the cryptic warnings, all suggested that the surface of Lydney Cross hid a far more dangerous current than anyone had imagined. The knock on her door came softly, almost hesitantly. It was Chief Inspector Cray, his brow furrowed and his expression weighed with the frustrations of the case. "Good evening, Miss Marple. I thought it prudent to keep you informed," he said, stepping inside at her invitation. "Please sit down," she offered, pouring a cup of tea with practiced ease. "What new developments?" Cray settled into an armchair, rubbing his temples. "We've found traces of the stolen documents. They were hidden beneath loose floorboards in the village hall, a place where anyone could have access." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And who discovered them?" "A young lad tidying up after the council meeting. The papers were damp but largely intact. Then the thief must have panicked and concealed them hurriedly," she mused. "Have you considered who else has access to the village hall?" "Several," Cray replied. "But the timing narrows it down. We believe the theft occurred late, at night, possibly the same night as Christopher's disappearance." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with sudden insight. "Have you questioned the council members about their whereabouts during that time?" "We have, but most claim to have been home or attending social engagements. There are discrepancies, however, in the alibis of one Mr. Philip Hawkins, the local banker." "Philip Hawkins," Miss Marple repeated softly. "An influential man, is he not?" "Very much so," Cray confirmed, "and not above using his position for personal gain." The inspector leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Miss Marple, I believe Hawkins may have been trying to protect his own interests. The ledger Christopher sought reportedly included some questionable financial dealings involving the bank." A flicker of knowing crossed Miss Marple's face. "That explains his nervousness when I mentioned the estate's legal file, and his avoidance during my earlier visit," Cray nodded grimly. "I intend to bring him in for questioning tomorrow." As Cray left, Miss Marple remained seated, her mind racing through the web of connections. Yet even as she considered Hawkins, she recalled the doctor's uneasy demeanour, the sombre words of Margaret Cartwright, and the secret meetings Harold Finch had hinted at. The puzzle was intricate, and the truth more dangerous than any of them suspected. The following morning, the village awoke to rumours swirling like autumn leaves caught in a sudden wind. The news of the solicitor's office break-in and the recovery of the papers beneath the village hall had already spread, fueling speculation and distrust. Yet none seemed as anxious as Philip Hawkins himself, who, when confronted by Inspector Cray, maintained a carefully crafted calm. In the small interrogation room at the police station, Hawkins was guarded but courteous. He denied all accusations, insisting his involvement with the Cartwright estate was strictly professional and above reproach. yet his glances betrayed a man wrestling with secrets. Miss Marple, invited by Cray to observe, noted the subtle signs of tension, twitching fingers, a throat cleared more than once, and a gaze that flickered to the door as if measuring escape routes. After Hawkins' release pending further investigation, Miss Marple decided to visit the village hall herself. The scene of the hidden documents might reveal details the official inquiry overlooked. Inside the dim room, beneath the creaking floorboards, she knelt and examined the damp papers, now carefully spread on a table. The ledger was meticulous, chronicling transactions that implicated several local figures in financial misdeeds, including forged documents, land manipulations, and illicit loans. But most striking was a series of entries linking the Cartwright family estate to an obscure trust, controlled by an unknown party. This trust might be the key, Miss Marple thought aloud, and someone clearly wanted it to remain secret. Her reflections were interrupted by a soft clearing of the throat. She looked up to see Margaret Cartwright standing hesitantly in the doorway, her face pale but resolute. "I thought you might find this interesting," Margaret said, holding out a faded envelope she had retrieved from her late nephew's belongings. Miss Marple took the envelope carefully and opened it to reveal a bundle of letters. Correspondence between Christopher and an anonymous confidant, discussing the trust and warning of those who would kill to protect their interests. "Do you think this could be the motive behind his disappearance?" Margaret asked, voice trembling. "It is a strong possibility," Miss Marple replied. "But we must be cautious. The truth is never as simple as it appears." Margaret hesitated, then added, "There's something else. Christopher mentioned he was to meet someone the night he vanished, someone who promised to reveal everything. Did he say who?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "No name, only a place. The old curtain in the garden." The phrase sent a shiver through Miss Marple, recalling Harold Finch's earlier mention of a nighttime meeting there. The curtain was not merely a backdrop, but a silent witness. As twilight fell, Miss Marple returned to the Cartwright estate to examine the garden. The thick curtain, weathered and tattered, hung limply from its frame, shielding the old stone wall from prying eyes. She ran her fingers over its frayed edges and paused, noting a faint but unmistakable scent of tobacco and lilac, the doctor's distinctive cologne, combined with the scent of Margaret's favourite perfume. This discovery deepened the mystery. Who else had been present that night? Why the secretive meeting? And what secrets did the curtain conceal beyond its outward appearance? Miss Marple's musings were interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Cray, summoned by a hastily sent note. Together, they searched beneath the curtain and discovered a loose stone in the garden wall, revealing a narrow cavity within. Inside lay a small, weathered box containing photographs, a diary, and what appeared to be a map of the estate, with certain areas marked. The diary belonged to Thomas Granger, revealing that his disappearance was no accident, but a carefully orchestrated escape from threats within the village. As Miss Marple read aloud passages from the diary, the full weight of the past collided with the present. Thomas had uncovered the truth about the trust and had planned to expose the corruption before vanishing. But someone had followed him, silencing both him and now Christopher. The pieces fell into place with growing clarity. The hidden trust, the break-in, the threatening letters, all pointed to a conspiracy to protect the power and wealth that had corrupted the village beneath its peaceful surface. Yet the question remained, who had the cunning to orchestrate such deception, manipulating village fears and alliances to cover their tracks? Miss Marple's mind returned once again to the doctor. His presence near the curtain that night, the faint scent mingled with the perfumes, and his reluctance to speak all suggested deeper involvement. Resolving to confront him subtly, Miss Marple planned a delicate psychological test, intending to provoke a revealing reaction without arousing suspicion. The final unraveling of the mystery, she sensed, was close at hand, hidden behind the curtain of appearances and guarded by the darkest fears of Lydney Cross. With the village watching and secrets waiting to be unmasked, Miss Marple prepared to play her most intricate game yet, a game that would force the killer into the light and the curtain to fall. The morning after her discovery beneath the garden curtain, Miss Marple found the village unusually silent, as if Lydney Cross itself held its breath, awaiting the next turn in the unfolding drama. She dressed carefully, selecting a modest hat and coat, and made her way toward the surgery where Dr. Reynolds maintained his practice. The doctor's demeanor had been shifting, guarded, evasive, ever since the shadows of suspicion first touched him. Now Miss Marple intended to observe him closely, to read the subtleties in his manner that might reveal the truth. Dr. Reynolds was expecting her. The faint tension in his posture betrayed the effort to maintain his usual calm. He greeted her with a polite smile, but his eyes betrayed something deeper, nervousness or perhaps anticipation. "Miss Marple, to what do I owe the pleasure?" he asked, motioning toward a small sitting area. "I thought it might be pleasant to have tea here, Doctor, away from the bustle of the village," she said lightly, settling into a chair, "and perhaps to chat about those peculiar events at the estate." The doctor stiffened imperceptibly, then nodded. "Yes, I suppose we must face those sooner or later." Miss Marple observed him with gentle patience, allowing silence to hang in the air before speaking. "You must understand, Doctor, that while the village speculates, the truth often lies in the small details, the moments that people overlook." He met her gaze steadily. "I can assure you, Miss Marple, that I have nothing to hide." "Of course," she replied with a mild smile, "yet sometimes even those closest to a secret cannot help but betray themselves by the smallest slip, a gesture, a word, a glance." The doctor's fingers tightened around his teacup. "You mentioned the garden curtain the other day." "I was there, yes. Christopher asked to meet me late that evening." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Indeed. And what did he wish to discuss at such an hour?" "He was distressed," Reynolds confessed. He had discovered something troubling about the family trust, something he feared might ruin more than just the estate. "And did he tell you who else was involved?" she asked softly. The doctor hesitated, then said quietly, "I fear I may have been the only one he trusted. But since his disappearance, I have feared for my own safety." Her expression remained serene, but inside, Miss Marple noted a subtle quiver, a crack in the doctor's carefully maintained facade. "Doctor," she said, "if you wish to protect yourself, hiding behind fear would not be the wisest course. The truth has a way of freeing the soul." He nodded slowly, seeming to gather courage. "Very well." Christopher confided that the true power behind the trust was not the family, but an outside figure, someone using the estate as a cover for financial manipulation, and worse. "Financial manipulation?" Miss Marple repeated, leaning forward. "More than that," Reynolds said gravely. "Illegal dealings, coercion." Christopher believed his uncle, Harold Finch, was entangled with dangerous people. He planned to confront Finch that very night, but never returned. The name struck Miss Marple deeply. Finch, who had appeared nervous and secretive earlier, suddenly took on a far more sinister aspect. "Did Christopher say where he planned to meet Harold Finch?" she asked. "The garden, near the curtain," Reynolds answered. "I suspect their meeting ended badly." Miss Marple's thoughts raced. Finch had evaded her inquiries, his vague alibis now seeming increasingly untenable. The pieces of the puzzle were converging on him. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Cray, his presence brisk and businesslike. "Miss Marple, I hope I'm not intruding. We have new developments at the village hall." Together, The three hurried to the village hall, where officers were inspecting a newly uncovered passage in the cellar. A hidden room previously unknown, concealed behind false walls. Inside, they found a cache of documents and a safe containing ledgers and personal papers implicating several villagers, including Finch, in a complex scheme of fraud and blackmail. Finch's fingerprints were discovered on several documents, and a torn letter addressed to him was found among the papers. The letter was a threat from an anonymous source warning him to cease his activities or face ruin. Back at her cottage that evening, Miss Marple sifted through the collected evidence and her own notes. The diary of Thomas Granger, the ledger from the hidden trust, the letters between Christopher and his confidant, all pointed to a conspiracy orchestrated by Finch. Yet something still unsettled her. The second body remained unidentified, and the shadow of another presence loomed over the village's secret dealings. Determined to press Finch further, Miss Marple arranged to visit him under the pretense of seeking reassurance for the village's sake. When she arrived at Finch's modest home, the man was visibly shaken, but maintained his defiance. "You think you have me cornered, Miss Marple," Finch said bitterly, "but you don't understand what you're dealing with. This estate, this village, is not just about money. It's about survival." "Survival," she echoed, her voice gentle but firm. "By silencing those who seek the truth." Finch's eyes flickered with anger and fear. "You don't know what it's like to be trapped, watched, threatened." Miss Marple regarded him calmly. "Yet even in darkness, one can find a way to the light. Tell me, Mr. Finch, what are you so desperate to hide?" His defiance faltered. "It was never meant to go this far. The trust was a safeguard, a way to protect the family's legacy. But greed and fear corrupted everything. Christopher threatened to expose us all." "And the second body?" Miss Marple pressed. Finch swallowed hard, avoiding her gaze. "He was a man who knew too much, someone I thought could be controlled." As Finch's confession spilled forth, the chilling reality settled in. He had orchestrated not only the disappearance but the murder, silencing anyone who threatened the delicate balance of power he sought to preserve. Yet, as Miss Marple had suspected, Finch was not acting alone. The network of deceit and intimidation stretched wider than one man could control. That night, Miss Marple sat by the fire, reflecting on the fragile nature of human trust and the shadows that often lurked beneath the most ordinary facades. She knew the final confrontation was near, and that only by carefully drawing out the remaining players could justice be served. The village of Lydney Cross awaited the moment when the curtain would finally fall, revealing the full truth beneath its deceptive calm. Miss Marple awoke early the next morning with a renewed sense of purpose. The night's revelations had tightened the threads of the mystery, yet a delicate web still held some strands hidden from view. Finch's partial confession was a breakthrough, but she sensed there were accomplices still cloaked in silence. The village's apparent calm was but a fragile veneer, ready to shatter under the weight of truth. She dressed quietly and made her way toward the village shop, a hub of gossip and discreet observation. There she found Mrs. Pettigrew, the shopkeeper, who greeted her with a curious glance. Miss Marple wasted no time, weaving into the casual conversation a series of subtle questions designed to draw out new information. "You know, Mrs. Pettigrew, it's often the smallest detail that slips by unnoticed," she remarked, examining a selection of biscuits on the shelf. "I was wondering if you had seen anything unusual around the estate in the days before the tragedy." Mrs. Pettigrew pursed her lips thoughtfully. "Well, now you mention it, there was something odd. A stranger passing through, young man, but he kept his head down. I thought nothing of it then, but now, with everything going on." "Did you catch his name or where he might be staying?" Miss Marple asked gently. "No, I'm afraid not. He was quiet and stayed mostly in the background, but I heard him ask after the Finch family at the local inn. This was a new piece of the puzzle. Someone unknown had appeared, possibly linked to the unfolding drama, yet invisible to most. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Pettigrew and made her way to the inn, where she hoped to glean more. At the inn, the landlord was wary but cooperative. "Ah, yes, I remember the fellow. Came here just before the storm broke. Said he was an old friend of Christopher's, gone quiet after the disappearance, though. Didn't stay long. An old friend of Christopher's. This could be the missing link." Miss Marple felt the shape of the mystery sharpening. If this stranger had come to Lydney Cross to find answers or perhaps to intervene, he might hold the key to unlocking the final secrets. Returning to her cottage, Miss Marple considered how to draw the hidden players out. Finch's confession indicated fear and desperation, and she was convinced that by gently probing the village's social fabric, she could provoke a revealing slip. That afternoon, Miss Marple accepted an invitation from Mrs. Ravenscroft, the village's most influential hostess, to tea. The occasion was thinly veiled as a social call, but Miss Marple's keen eyes soon noted the tension beneath the polite veneer. Mrs. Ravenscroft's smile was brittle, and her eyes flickered with cautious calculation. As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple steered the conversation with the delicacy of a practiced hand, touching on the estate's affairs and the recent disturbances. Gradually, Mrs. Ravenscroft's carefully maintained composure faltered. "People talk too much," she said at last, her voice low. "Secrets are best left buried. Christopher was foolish to dig where he shouldn't." "Foolish or courageous?" Miss Marple replied softly. "Sometimes it takes a brave soul to disturb the silence that hides injustice." Mrs. Ravenscroft's glance sharpened. "And sometimes that disturbance brings ruin. The estate is more than land and money. It is the livelihood of many. If Christopher had succeeded, many would have lost everything." Miss Marple nodded, sensing that the web of motives was growing ever more tangled. But at what cost to justice and truth? One wonders if the true danger lies not in discovery, but in the desperate lengths some will go to preserve a fragile power. Before Mrs. Ravenscroft could respond, the door opened and a tall man stepped inside, a stranger with a weathered face and eyes that held both sorrow and resolve. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened immediately. "Mr. Caldwell," Mrs. Ravenscroft said stiffly. What a surprise! The newcomer's eyes found Miss Marple's with a quiet intensity. "I've come to find out what really happened to Christopher." The room fell silent. Mrs. Ravenscroft's hand trembled slightly as she poured tea. Miss Marple studied Mr. Caldwell carefully. His presence was unexpected, but the sincerity in his voice and the careful way he avoided direct accusation suggested he might be the ally she needed. Over the course of the visit, Mr. Caldwell revealed that he had once worked with Christopher, long before the troubles of the trust began. He spoke of a growing shadow over the estate, whispers of threats, of coercion by figures who wished to control more than just money. "I tried to warn him," Caldwell said quietly. But Christopher was determined to bring the truth to light, no matter the danger. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The new information dovetailed with what she had already uncovered, pointing to a conspiracy more sinister than mere greed. The sun set and Caldwell took his leave. Miss Marple was left with a growing conviction. The second body, the hidden passages, the forged documents, all pieces of a complex puzzle woven from fear, betrayal, and desperate ambition. That evening, Miss Marple summoned Inspector Cray and laid out the newest developments. They agreed to investigate Mr. Caldwell's background while continuing to scrutinize the estate's inner circle. In the quiet that followed, Miss Marple sat by her fire, reflecting on the fragile balance between power and morality. The village she loved was caught in a web of secrets and lies. But as always, she trusted that truth would prevail. The curtain was nearly ready to fall. Soon, all would be revealed, and justice restored to Lydney Cross. As dawn filtered gently through the lace curtains of her sitting room, Miss Marple sat quietly, her fingers interlaced, eyes reflecting the steady calm of a mind deep in thought. The village of Lydney Cross had returned to its everyday rhythm, but beneath the surface, the threads of deception were poised to unravel completely. The pieces of the puzzle, gathered carefully over many days, now fit together with a clarity only her patient observations could reveal. She had invited all the key figures from the village, the Finches, Mrs. Ravenscroft, Mr. Caldwell, and a few others, to the old drawing room of the village hall under the pretence of sharing the latest developments. The room was filled with a tense anticipation, whispered speculations flickering like shadows across the faces of those assembled. Miss Marple began with gentle warmth, her voice unassuming but firm. "Thank you all for coming. I understand these are difficult times, but sometimes it is necessary to bring everything into the open to find peace." She glanced at each person in turn, noting the subtle changes in expression, the flicker of unease. Christopher Finch's death, tragic as it was not the result of accident or coincidence, nor was the other body concealed behind the curtain, a fact that deepened the mystery. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. The truth is that the estate was the battleground for more than just land and money. It was a conflict of pride, secrecy, and desperate preservation. Turning to Mr. Finch, who sat pale and shaken, she continued, "Your brother, Christopher, was indeed brave to uncover what had long been hidden, but his discovery threatened powerful interests protected by more than just fear." Her gaze shifted to Mrs. Ravenscroft, who sat rigid, her composure unravelling. "Mrs. Ravenscroft, you spoke of livelihood and fragile power. It was that power you sought to defend, even if it meant silencing those who threatened it." A hush fell. Mrs. Ravenscroft's eyes darted, then finally met Miss Marple's steady gaze. "You have no proof," she said, voice trembling but defiant. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Proof, my dear, is often found not only in documents or witnesses but in human nature itself. The forged letters, the sudden arrival of Mr. Caldwell, and the behaviour of those closest to the estate, each a thread in a tapestry that cannot be undone without revealing the whole." She turned to Mr. Caldwell. "Your presence here was a turning point. Your knowledge of past threats and your loyalty to Christopher made you an ally in this dark time." Mr. Caldwell inclined his head, acknowledging the truth in her words. Finally, Miss Marple addressed the room as a whole. The second body concealed behind the curtain was that of Mr. Thomas Cray, an old servant loyal to the Finch family who discovered the plot and paid the ultimate price for his silence. His death was the final tragic attempt to keep the secrets buried. Eyes widened, breaths caught. The village's darkest secret was no longer a whisper, but a shared reality. Turning to Inspector Cray, Miss Marple concluded, "Justice must follow, but let us remember that beneath these actions lies human frailty, fear, love, and desperation, all intertwined." As the crowd dispersed, the burden of truth lifted, yet left a lingering ache. Miss Marple remained in the quiet room, reflecting on the delicate balance of human nature. In Lydney Cross, peace could return, but the memory of the curtain that hid the second body would remind all that the shadows beneath the surface must never be ignored. Her work was done, for now, but the village and its secrets would always keep her vigilant.